Not long ago, in the ancient kingdom of Iraka, there lived a man named Nico. Nico was quite an ugly man whose looks would normally elicit derision. His head had a split in the middle that elongated the back of his head extensively, and the front had a huge forehead. He lived a lonely life in Iraka as no one would associate with him. Some called him the rejected of the gods, as nothing he ever did succeeded. Nico lived at the edge of Iraka. Iraka was a beautiful place, situated at the base of the big river that flowed from the furthest parts of the earth. Its lush fields produced the best yams in the entire riverine communities. Everyone else in Iraka benefited from the kingdom's natural prosperity except Nico. He was a man who seemed destined for failure. Nico tried his hand at many trades, just like every other young man in the kingdom, but none were successful. When he attempted farming, his crops failed miserably because he often forgot to till the land and weed the farm. When he tried palm wine tapping, he fell from the tree. On his very first climb, the rope he tied around the base of the palm tree broke, just as he put his foot on the tree trunk. Nico gave up instantly, believing it was a sign from the gods. No matter what he tried, Nico always failed. But there was one thing Nico was exceptionally good at, being happy. Regardless of his circumstances, Nico always wore a smile on his face. The people of Iraka wondered why he was such a happy man, despite never succeeding at anything. Nico didn't bother anyone, but his infectious happiness had a strange effect on the married women of the kingdom. They were drawn to him like ants to sugar. Whenever Nico went out to try a new venture, he would return to find his lonely hut filled with the finest meals, delivered by the wives of other men in the kingdom. At first, the men of Iraka didn't see this as a problem, but when their wives began to compete over whose food Nico would eat first, they started to worry. The situation escalated to the point where the men stopped going to the farm, afraid that Nico had somehow charmed their wives. The wives, undeterred by their husbands' vigilance, always found a way to sneak out and bring supper to Nico's hut. Each time they returned, they checked if the meals they had left the night before had been eaten. It was easy to tell whose meal had been eaten because that person would be seen going home dancing and singing, hurrying to go make a new meal for Nico, while the others sulked and became irritable. One day, all the women of Iraka arrived at Nico's hut at the same time, each carrying their best dishes. Among them was the king's youngest wife, who had brought food for Nico in the king's golden plate. The food looked so delicious that all the other wives became angry and sad. As they laid their platters by Nico's door, the young queen, who noticed their sad demeanor, called them together and asked them to sit for a quick talk before Nico returned from his latest worthless venture. "We need to talk," the young queen said. "If we don't come to an agreement, the line of women bringing food to Nico's home will only get longer. Soon, we'll be competing with our daughters for Nico's palate." The women agreed to create a roster, allowing only 3 women of Iraka to bring food to Nico each week. They selected the first 3 women to start the next day. But this arrangement didn't last long. Just after a few days of drawing up the roster, all the women became restless every evening as they couldn't take food to Nico's hut. This made the men in Iraka worried. The situation became very terrible for Iraka as the men stayed home all the time. They could no longer go to their farms, they stopped going to fish and even couldn't make out time to sit at the council of elders. All this to prevent their wives from visiting Nico. Food became scarce, as the barns and stores gradually emptied without fresh produce. The palm fruits got so full that the wine in them began to drip onto the ground. This made the ants, the monkeys, and many other animals perpetually drunk, making them to cause more havoc on the farmlands. The situation worsened when the king's oldest daughter was caught sneaking to Nico's hut to deliver food, even before she had joined her mothers to make dinner for the king. Furious, the king demanded that all the wives in the kingdom stand before the god of chastity. They were to swear that none of them had had any relations with Nico. Every female of marriage age stood before Udunku, the god of chastity, to swear before it that Nico had never seen their nakedness. The king and all the men in the kingdom waited outside the shrine as one by one the women went in. But as they went in, they came out one by one without the expected lightning striking any of them. The men doubted the god and summoned the priest before the council. The council, led by the very doubtful Ibarbio, questioned the reliability of Udunku. Ibarbio said he was so sure he once heard a woman that sounded like Iku's wife scream in pleasure from inside Nico's hut. Iku, a smallish man, jumped before the king and said he had on many times seen Ibarbio's wives and daughters sneaking out of Nico's hut every morning. Both men quarreled before the king and the priest. The king silenced them and asked the priest if Udunku had been compromised. "Who dares to do that without being struck down?" "My king," the priest said, "even the wives of your dear priests have been taking meals to that worthless man. What annoys me the most is, they make a feast fit for the gods for him every evening." The king had had no knowledge of his wives visiting Nico's hut until one evening his oldest wife was caught sneaking to Nico's hut by the king himself. This brought him shame and he cried before the village chiefs. To spite the king more, Ibarbio told him his youngest wife had also been meeting with Nico. The king wailed louder and rolled all over the palace floor crying. "Bring that useless, ugly man here," the king demanded. The king's guards ran to Nico's hut, but he hadn't returned. Nico had recently found an abandoned boat and had taken up fishing. It didn't take time before he figured he was just as useless at that as everything else. But even with the ill luck, he got back every evening believing his luck would change. The guards hid in the bushes waiting for Nico. While they hid, women began trooping in with food. The guards saw their wives delivering food at Nico's hut. This infuriated them so much they wanted to come out of hiding and beat them up. But the king's errand was more important than any other thing, so they wailed silently as their wives and other women competed with where to drop their meals for Nico. The guards caught a glimpse of Nico arriving at the riverbank. He was inspecting his net for a catch. They seized him and took him before the king. "Take off his robe and bring my royal sword?" the king bellowed. "What have I done?" "Your Majesty," Nico asked. "What problems have I caused that makes you want to kill me?" "I'm not killing you. I just want to cut off your manhood," the king said. "What for?" "Your Highness. You have yours, and every other man has his." "What do you need mine for?" Nico interrupted, still smiling. The king looked around and saw all his wives smiling at Nico, enchanted. This further infuriated him, and he ordered his guards to tie him up. "So you have charmed all our wives just because you are ugly and cannot have your wife," the king said. Nico looked confused. "Why are you pretending?" the king demanded. "Aren't you the one they bring food to every evening?" Still looking confused, Nico glanced at the sky, checking the position of the moon. The king grabbed a whip from one of the guards and lashed Nico's neck. He screamed out in pain but kept smiling, which made the king's wives and the other women present cry out in sympathy. The king and the men were bewildered. The king then ordered the guards to untie Nico. They did and asked him to sit on the bare floor. "My king, I need to be in my house before the moon sets above our heads," Nico said. "From what I see, that's just a few moments away." "Why?" the king asked. "Your Majesty, I need to eat," Nico replied, eager to leave the king's presence. The king laughed. "What sort of food are you talking about? You are in the palace. You could get a feast here if you desired it." But Nico didn't answer. He just ran off into the night, leaving the king, his guards, and the other men in disbelief. The guards wanted to chase after him, but the king stopped them. Nico ran through the thick bushes, constantly looking up at the moon's position. The closer the moon got to its zenith, the faster he ran. He eventually reached his hut just as the moon hung directly overhead. He jumped into it, and as he landed, 2 fairy maidens appeared before him. The maidens were breathtakingly beautiful, their skin glowed with an enchanting dark chocolatey hue. They said nothing to Nico or to each other. They sat patiently and watched as Nico brought in one dish after another, feeding them and himself. After a while of eating and drinking, they all fell asleep until almost dawn. The 2 women returned to the river, each entering the water from opposite ends of the bank. They were identical in height, with the same glimmering skin and long silky hair. "See you again this evening," Nico said as he stepped onto the north bank of the river. The water level rose high above the banks, but it didn't overflow. The maidens did this to prevent any fishermen from venturing out early. That morning, Iraka was woken up with loud screams and wailing. The men of Iraka woke up and couldn't find their wives and marriage-aged daughters. Ibarbio was the first to sound the alarm. He ran across town screaming and wailing. His 3 wives and 14 daughters were nowhere to be found. As he was wailing, Iku ran out to the square too, holding his oldest wife's wrapper. "This is what she slept with last night. Who took my wife and my daughters?" The town square became filled with crying men and sons, men crying for their wives and daughters, sons crying for their mothers and sisters. "Let us head to the king's palace, he must have answers," Ibibio shouted. The men began marching towards the palace, wailing and angry as they did. But as they approached the king's palace, they saw the king and his guards running to the square. The men, seeing the king run towards them with all his might, turned around and started running back to their homes, afraid their king was running away from a spirit. "Wait, wait!" the king shouted before they all stopped. Panting, the king explained why he was running and told them his guards and palace staff ran to him saying their wives and daughters were missing. "Oh mighty king, have you checked on your wives and daughters too?" Ibabio asked. Then the king realized none of his older daughters had come to greet him that morning. Realizing his wives and daughters could be gone, he wailed loudly. Then they all realized that the only man not out in the square was Nico. "Where is that man Nico? Why is he not here with us?" Iku said. "He can't be here, he doesn't have any woman around him," said Ibabio, laughing. "But your wives and daughters visit him every evening like all of our wives too." Iku replied. "What do you mean by that?" An angered Ibabio said, and he rushed towards Iku to fight. But the men held them apart. Then it occurred to them at the gathering to go check Nico's hut. The king went back to his palace and urged them to go check Nico's place. The men, led by the rebellious Ibarbio, ran desperately to Nico's end of the community. He lived alone at the edge of the community. On approaching Nico's hut, the men saw the long line of women dressed in their best attires waiting at Nico's house. The women looked very happy. The early morning sun shone brightly on their smile, making them even more attractive. The array of feasts laid around Nico's hut looked so good that the men didn't complain. They just sat on the floor and devoured all the food their wives and daughters had brought to Nico. They then led the women home. That afternoon, Ibarbio summoned all the men together, and they marched to the palace demanding the king send Nico away on exile or they will summon the gods of the land to depose the king from his throne. The king thought of what to do day and night. But even as he did his best to find a solution, Ibarbio wasn't satisfied. Ibarbio, a cunning and skeptical man, had always harbored hatred toward Nico. His envy was fueled not just by disbelief that Nico had a powerful god that has made him charm all the women in the community, but he also felt a man like him, much more handsome, should be the one getting all the attention from the women of the kingdom and not Nico. Especially from the king's youngest wife and oldest daughter. The way his wives and daughters also constantly spoke of Nico enraged him. They often compared Ibarbio to Nico, praising Nico's kindness, happiness, and gentle spirit, qualities Ibarbio lacked. "Ibarbio, why can't you be more like Nico?" his wives would say, their voices tinged with admiration for Nico. "He may not be successful, but he is always content, always smiling." His daughters would often chime in, "Nico doesn't get angry over small things. He's always so patient and kind." These daily comparisons bothered Ibarbio deeply, gnawing at his pride. He couldn't understand why anyone would prefer Nico, a man who had failed at every venture he attempted. A very ugly poor man, over him, who is a man of stature and influence in the kingdom, rich beyond measure, with large barns of crops and multiple wives and children. The constant praise of Nico from his household drove Ibarbio to the brink of madness. Determined to expose Nico as a fraud and put an end to the comparisons, Ibarbio devised a plan to kidnap Nico and force him to admit that he charmed the women with bad luck. One day, when Nico's nightly visitors had left before dawn, under the cover of darkness, Ibarbio and his men snuck into Nico's hut. They bound him tightly and gagged him before dragging him deep into the forest, far from the river banks. But at daylight, when Nico did not return to the river for his worthless fishing adventures, the river knew something was wrong. The waters of the river stirred with unease, and the wind whispered the water's growing anger. The river sensed Nico's distress and rose above the banks and began to flood the farmlands of Iraka. Within a twinkling of an eye, the community was covered in water without a single drop of rain. This gave the king concerns, and he summoned his council of chiefs and water priests. All of them waded through the waters to the palace, but Ibarbio wasn't present. The water priest consulted the water oracle and screamed immediately. He threw his cowries on the wet palace floor. He immediately grabbed his cowries and bag and ran away from the palace without saying what he had seen. Iku and other chiefs ran after him in fear, but they couldn't catch up to him. Meanwhile, Ibarbio and his men tied Nico to a large tree in the heart of the forest. "Speak!" Ibarbio demanded, his voice filled with malice. "What have you used on our wives and daughters? Why are they so happy around you and miserable around their husbands and fathers?" Nico, though frightened, remained resolute. Even with his life on the line, he refused to betray the goddesses of the river who had shown him kindness. "I have no magic, no powers," Nico said, his voice calm despite his fear. "The spirit of the river has just blessed me with a happy presence." This infuriated Ibarbio, and he slashed Nico's hand with a machete. "You want to kill him?" one of his men asked. "Yes, he should die. Of what use is he to Iraka?" But just as he said this, a bright loud thunder and lightning bolt lashed into the river, and the water spiraled into a vortex. "Confess that you're evil. If you admit your crimes, we may spare your life." Ibarbio continued shouting at Nico. "I am innocent, I have never charmed anybody in Iraka." Nico cried out. He was now bleeding in his arm. "Lies!" Ibarbio shouted, raising his hand once more to strike Nico. But before he could land a blow, the sky darkened, and a powerful gust of wind swept through the forest, forcing Ibarbio and his men to the ground. Then large drops of hailstones began to fall. Ibarbio and his men took shelter in an abandoned barn. However, Nico, still tied to the tree, was spared from this hammering of hailstones. Not a single hail touched him, and his clothes were dried. Ibarbio and his men from their hiding spot saw Nico still smiling and dried. By now the hails had begun to pile up on the forest floor, and the sky got even darker. The vortex in the river grew wider, and the gust of wind was pulling everything into the vortex. But Nico, being dried and still smiling, angered Ibarbio more. He and his men began to curse the gods of the rains. The curses enraged the river more. From the middle of the vortex and spiraling wind came two astonishingly beautiful women. The water goddesses Yemoja and Mammy Water. They appeared before the wicked men through a hailstorm, their forms towering and fearsome, their eyes glowing with a blaring lightning. Ibarbio and his men trembled on their feet. The river roared in response to the fury of the goddesses and flooded the farmlands of Iraka. "You dare to harm our chosen one?" Mammy Water's voice echoed through the hail, filled with wrath. "You dare to question our powers?" The second goddess Yemoja stepped forward, her voice cold and unforgiving. "For your arrogance, you shall feel the wrath of the waters. The earth shall know our anger and your lands will wither and die." As the goddesses spoke, the ground began to crack open, the trees withered and the plants died. The river, once a source of life and prosperity for Iraka, flooded the village from end to end and then began to recede, leaving the land dry and barren. The skies darkened permanently, and the crops dried up because of a lack of sunlight. The once lush fields of Iraka became a wasteland, cursed by the goddess's wrath. Ibarbio, now terrified and filled with regret, begged for mercy. "Please, great goddesses, forgive us. We were wrong to doubt you. Spare our land." But Mammy Water and Yemoja were unmoved. "You will learn that there are consequences for your actions," they declared in unison. "Nico is under our protection, and any harm that comes to him will be repaid 1,000-fold. With that, the goddesses vanished, leaving behind a devastated land and a broken people. Nico was released from his bonds by the frightened men, who could only watch as he walked back to his hut. It was the only structure that had not been affected by the devastation. It was even made more beautiful by the storm. From that day on, no one in Iraka dared to speak ill of Nico. The men who once mocked him now avoided him out of fear. The women who had vied for his attention did so no more as they feared the goddesses. Iraka was forever changed. A once prosperous kingdom was reduced to a barren wasteland, all because of the jealousy of the men and the pride of Ibarbio. As for Ibarbio, the king stripped him of his title because he had brought calamity to the land. He was banished from the land and his wives and daughters married off to strange men. He lived out the rest of his days in misery, haunted by the curse he had brought upon his people. But Nico, being the kind-hearted person he was, saw how unhappy and miserable the people of Iraka had become. He pleaded with the goddesses to restore the land. They agreed, and within a short period, Iraka began to flourish again. The happiness returned and Nico continued to live his life quietly and humbly, and still smiling. But now, no man objected to their wives and daughters cooking for Nico. Everyone knew that Nico's happiness was not born of naivety but of a deep connection to forces far greater than any of them could comprehend. The end. Thank you for watching. Please watch out for our next story. The Many Lovers of the Pastor's Daughter. Please like, share and subscribe.